What if? I'm echoing a little. What if? What if I knew then what I knew now? What if I could go back and change something? What if I could time travel? You know, like Back to the Future. Those sort of movies, you know? Some of those movies make it seem so easy, you know? Just go back in time. It's a fascinating idea. I've always loved stories about time travel. Something about that concept of going back in time and being able to see things the way they used to be. For you, maybe you'd like to visit a sporting event in the distant past. Or maybe you'd like to see some historical event in the distant past. Or just to be an eyewitness to history. Of course, time travel stories often involve the fantasy of going back to the past and changing something so that you can come back to the present and everything is different. But those sort of fantasies bring up one problem if you think about it. Let me give you a few facts. Here are some facts that would make time travel a problem if it were possible. Do you ever consider the Earth is traveling around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour? Our solar system is traveling through the galaxy at 448,000 miles an hour. And our whole galaxy is moving through space at over 1,000,000 miles an hour. If you really traveled through time, you would arrive in the past where the Earth used to be. And so you would just appear in the void of space where the Earth once was, and you would have only a few seconds before you would meet the Lord Almighty. Unfortunately, we can't go back and change the past. That's the bad news. But the good news is this. What happens in the past can be redeemed by God in ways we can't imagine. Jesus has a way of surprising people, of overturning their expectations. Our scripture today is about Jesus, and it's about the people he loves. Jesus doesn't do the things we expect him to. Yet for the people in the story in our scripture, as well as in our own lives, even if Jesus doesn't do what we expect him to, when we trust him, amazing things happen. We're going to look at John chapter 11 this morning. We'll begin with verse 1. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one whom you love is ill. When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness isn't fatal. It's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. After 2 days, he said to his disciples, let's return to Judea again. The disciples replied, Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you. But you want to go back? And Jesus answered, aren't there 12 hours in a day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble because the light isn't in them. He continued, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I'm going in order to wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will get well. They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep. But Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death. Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe. Let's go to him. Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to comfort Martha and Mary after her brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask, God will give you." And Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She replied, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who is coming into the world." After she said this, she went and spoke privately to her sister Mary. "The teacher is here and he's calling for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. He hadn't entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were comforting Mary in the house saw her get up quickly and leave, they followed her. They assumed she was going to mourn at the tomb. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, "See how much he loved him?" But some of them said, "He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone covered the entrance. And Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead for 4 days." And Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus, he shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied and his face covered with cloth. And Jesus said to him, "Untie him and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews came with Mary, and they saw what Jesus did and believed in him. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. I remember watching a TV miniseries years ago about the Bible. Most of it was all right, but it got to this section right here. It got to this story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. It's got to be one of the most cinematic moments that you could think of. Especially like you read through the Bible and just, what a great scene. All these people gathered around and crying, and Jesus shouts, "Lazarus, come forth." And this guy wrapped in his burial clothes comes out of the tomb like a mummy. Like, how could you get a better scene than that? And that show made it some subdued thing where Jesus goes into the tomb and quietly says something. I'm thinking, the most dramatic moment next to the crucifixion, perhaps. Yeah. It's a dramatic moment. It's a moment that changed everything. In this passage, we see both Jesus' godhood, that he was God, and we see his humanity. He was also human. He loved Lazarus and his sisters. When he sees the anguish that Mary and Martha are going through, he weeps, he cries. But if we look at how this story begins with him receiving word that Lazarus is ill, He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't in a panic. He waited there for a couple of days. He knew that this was part of something bigger. This was leading to a pivotal moment in Jesus' earthly journey. The resurrection of Lazarus created a greater level of fear and urgency among the religious leaders who were plotting to kill Jesus. After a couple of days, he now wants to go to Bethany. Now, Bethany was just a couple of miles from Jerusalem. And maybe perhaps 3 months ago he had been there, and they tried to kill him. And now he wants to go back. The disciples were shocked. You want to go there? They tried to kill you last time. But Jesus was willing to lay down his life for those he loves. That's just one of those truths about him. In verses 9 and 10, it says, Jesus answered, are there 12 hours in the day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble, because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble, because the light isn't in them. What does Jesus mean by that? I think Jesus is saying it doesn't make sense to walk in the darkness of night when we can't see. Have you ever tried to do that? Walk in the darkness of night? It usually doesn't end well. But we're to walk in the light of the world. I think the key to understanding this is that Jesus says those walking in darkness are doing so because the light of the world isn't in them. He's not talking about just literal going out at night. He's talking about walking without the light in them. Many people wander through life doing what seems best. And the truth is, you can muddle through life without God. But it's like walking in the darkness. You're just stumbling around blindly. I remember when I was a teenager, me and some friends, we were out and we were kind of walking around in the dark, and we had flashlights, but we turned them off because we thought it was fun. And we're walking, and all of a sudden, one of my friends turns on his flashlight, just as me and another friend were about to step over this like steep embankment. And I'm thinking, man, that turning on that light at that moment saved my life. The light is good. Light saves us. When we can focus on the light, then everything's all right. Jesus is the light of the world. He is the light we must walk by. It's easy to not know where we're going. But if we follow the light of Jesus, he will guide our path. When Jesus gives those whom he met when he physically walked the earth an invitation, or when he gives any of us an invitation to follow him, it's about looking to the one who can light up our path through this dark, sin-scarred world. Jesus is saying, trust me. This is the way. Thomas, remember, Thomas is famous for being doubting Thomas. And that story will come a little later, but Thomas says something in verse 16. He says, let us go to, that we may die with Jesus. Those are the words Thomas says here. But I would love to know the tone of his voice and the expression on his face, because there are different ways you could take that. Is Thomas a pessimist? If Thomas is a pessimist, he may be kind of shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, we might as well go die with him. They're going to kill him there. Or perhaps Thomas says this with a swagger, like an action movie hero. If we're going down with Jesus. Let's roll, We don't know. But we know his words. If we're going to do this, let's do it together with Jesus. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. Thomas, we know this about Thomas. Thomas is loyal. He's willing to trust Jesus and go to this place where it's not safe. He's willing to follow Jesus even if it means death. Do Do we trust Jesus like that? Thankfully, most of us in this world today, following Jesus, trusting him like that, means dying to ourselves. Saying, okay, maybe I want this. Maybe I'd like to do this, but I want to follow Jesus regardless of what I really want. I want to go where he wants me to go, not where I want to go. Do we trust Jesus like that? Mary and Martha, these two sisters, they're mentioned in another story here we'll get to later, but Mary and Martha share a similar thought in this story. Martha comes to Jesus and says in verse 21, "What if, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And Mary says the same exact thing in verse 32, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." If Jesus had come early and healed Lazarus, it would have been another miracle, and more might have believed. But Jesus came according to his time. He always comes through in his time. He did something that went beyond the other healings he had done. He did something that would bring everything God had been doing since the beginning to a climax. Raising Lazarus from the dead for all those people to see was going to change everything. There's a couple of other stories of Jesus raising somebody from the dead. But in those stories, he's discreet. It's behind closed doors. He says, don't tell anyone. Here, in this big, dramatic moment, Jesus says to a dead man, "Get up and come up and live." And he does. And he says the same thing to us. Get up, come out of the tomb and live. In fact, and if we were to look forward at John chapter 12, the religious leaders who were plotting to kill Jesus, now they begin plotting to kill Lazarus, because Lazarus was a walking billboard proclaiming Jesus really is the Messiah. Martha and Mary couldn't see that yet. They were still in the pain. They were so focused on what Jesus could have done a few days ago that they weren't thinking about what Jesus would do today. Are we so different? Sometimes we focus so much on what we wish would have happened in the past that we lose sight of what Jesus is doing today and could do tomorrow. Sometimes we think, Lord, if it wasn't for this, I would follow you in obedience. Lord, if you had done this, my life would be different. Lord, if only it wasn't for this, then I could be who you want me to be. The truth is, if we had as much faith in what God can do in our present circumstances and in our future as in what he could have done in the past, that God's work in our lives would bear amazing fruit. I think some of us on a personal level, we can look back at our lives and we can see amazing things God has done. And we have complete faith in what God has done. Do we have as much faith in what God will do today and in what God will do tomorrow? We must not be so focused on the past that we miss what God has for us now and in the future. We always seem to come to God with our own set of expectations. Jesus replied to Mary and Martha in the conversation they had. Shows that our what ifs and our desire to want to travel back to the past and change things, it isn't like we see in the movies. Theologian N.T. Wright says about this passage, Instead of looking at the past and dreaming about what might have been, but now can't be, he invites her to look to the future. And then having looked to the future, he asks her to imagine that the future is suddenly brought forwards into the present. In other words, look to the future, and God, who holds that future in his hands, you can trust him. You can trust him and then live a life with trust in God to see you through. If we believe God holds the future, our future, in his hands, do we trust him with it? Will we live in trust in him? Following Jesus can often feel like walking in darkness, but nothing can be further from the truth. The way I've thought about it before is sometimes Jesus keeps us on a need-to-know basis, and we don't need to know yet. And perhaps that's a good thing. I can look back at different points in my life and think, wow, if God had showed me where this was leading, I don't know if I could have gone through it. Following Jesus, sometimes it feels like we're on a need-to-know basis. But we can trust him to light our way. We can trust him to light our path. Remember, first and above all else, remember that God loves you. Remember that Jesus already laid down his life for you. Remember that God has showed us what to do. Jesus said this. Jesus told us what to do. He said, follow the two great commandments. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And love others as you love yourself. Those commandments are not so different from what the Old Testament prophet Micah said. He said, act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I can't think of better words to live by. Walk justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God, allowing him to light our path. Will we walk with him by trusting that he will light our path, even if we can only see a little ways into the night? If you think about it, when you turn on a flashlight at night, it helps you to see. But it only helps you to see so far ahead. It only lights up what's immediately in front of you. But we trust the flashlight will continue to light our path as we're walking forward, showing just what we need to know to take the next few steps. Do we trust God that way? Do we trust him to light our path a few steps at a time and to continue doing that? Trusting in Jesus and following him through life, it can be a lot like that sometimes. We would like to see everything in our path, even a long ways down the road. We want visibility for miles ahead. But he only usually shows us the next few steps. The real question is, will we keep trusting him? Follow him. Where is he heading? Where is Jesus heading? Well, in our story, in the Bible, from this passage, we can perceive that Jesus is heading towards the cross. Jesus is heading to see those he loves and raise one man from the dead. But in the bigger story, Jesus is heading towards the cross. Jesus is heading towards laying down his life to save yours and mine. Jesus is walking through a sin-scarred, broken world so that he might conquer sin and death once and for all. The truth is, Jesus is still walking through this world with his people. By his Spirit, he is calling the lost to follow him. He is calling his disciples who love him to keep their eyes on him so that they don't stumble in the darkness. He's calling his disciples to walk together as his body in this world. We can look at the world around us, and some of you are younger and it may not seem like it at the time, but there's going to come a day where you're going to look at the world around you and say, wow, things have changed so much. Because the world is always changing. And we can't go back in time and change the past. But if we keep our eyes on what Jesus is doing, we can still be we can still have confidence that we are in his hands, and we can still be his hands and feet in this world, no matter how much it changes. We can't travel back to the past and undo things that have happened. But Jesus is the great Redeemer. And it's amazing what he can do and what he will do. And he invites us to follow him. If you look up the word redeem in Webster's dictionary, what we find is the word redeem pretty much describes Jesus, or what Jesus has been doing in the world. According to Webster's dictionary, the word redeem means to buy back, repurchase, to get or win back, to free from what distresses or harms, such as to free from captivity by payment of ransom, to extricate from, or to help overcome something detrimental, to release from blame or debt, to free from the consequences of sin, to change for the better, reform, repair, restore, to free from a lien by payment of an amount secured thereby, to remove the obligation of the payment, to make good, to fulfill, to atone, redeem an error, to offset the bad effect, to make worthwhile, to retrieve. This is what Jesus has been doing in our world. He is our Redeemer. It's why he came. And he can bring redemption. He can bring redemption to our community. He can bring redemption to our world. He can bring redemption to our place of work or our school. He can bring redemption to our family. He can bring redemption to our own lives. He can redeem all of it. When life in this world gets hard, when it gets scary, when it gets painful, keep your eyes on where Jesus is going and follow him. So often people spend their whole lives trying to figure out who they are and where they're going. But here's the thing, here's the thing I want you to remember. As you walk through this world, you may not always know exactly where the path ahead of you leads. But know this, knowing who we are, it's not as important as knowing who we're following. Knowing who we are following is way more important than knowing where we're going. Keep your eyes on Jesus, and he will keep lighting as much of the path as you need to see. The question really is, will we trust him? Would the guys come and we'll sing one last song together. Knowing who you're following is way more important than knowing where you're going. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace and faith, so that you overflow with hope by the power of his Holy Spirit.